Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Tokola of KEI. I have a discussion about U.S.-China relations, and there's discussion of U.S.-Korea relations, but less is said about China-Korea relations. We are fortunate, therefore, to have with us Professor Chung Jae of Seoul National University to give us an expert Korean perspective on China. Dr. Chung is a professor of international relations and director of the program on U.S.-China relations at Seoul National University. His most recent book, which I see is available on Amazon, is called Centrifugal Empire, Central Local Relations in China. For audience questions, so please feel free to submit them anytime via YouTube chat. So Professor Chung, thank you for joining us. Next year will be the 30th anniversary of China-South Korea diplomatic relations. Will that be a time for a special examination of the relationship?
I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Oh, I was going to begin by asking you about the 30th anniversary next year of South Korean and Chinese diplomatic relationship. So I was asking if that's going to be a time for a special examination of Korea-China relations.
Yes, a lot of people are doing research on that. And actually, I have a book forthcoming in 3 weeks or so. The title is the Crossroad for Survival, and the subtitle is U.S.-China Relations and Korea in the 21st Century. The book consists of 11 chapters, and actually chapter 9 of that book provides a critical overview of Korea-China relations for the last 30 years. In my view, I think Korea-China relations for the last 30 years experienced 4 major crises. And the first 2 crises, mainly the Garlic Battle and the Korea controversy, were mostly bilateral in nature. In other words, Korea-China were involved in it. And they were also non-hard security issues. However, the 3rd and 4th crisis, that is Cheonan-Yeonpyeong crisis, as well as the THAAD problem, the latter 2 crises involve the 3rd party, whether the US or North Korea. And also these 2 crises involved traditional hard security issues, thereby making resolution more difficult. So I guess as time progresses, Korea-China relations are facing problems that are more difficult to resolve than before.
One of the really striking facts about China-Korea relations today is that public opinion surveys shows a rise in anti-China sentiment in Korea, especially among young people. So how do you account for that, and what does it matter?
That is a very interesting and hot topic these days, and there are many seminars being held about that issue in Korea and elsewhere. Let me say a couple of points about South Koreans' public opinions toward China. I have checked about 6-7 different sources which have conducted public opinion surveys about Koreans' perceptions toward China. First of all, I think the Pew survey, most recently in June this year, as well as the joint survey by Yomiuri Shimbun and Hanguk Daily, also the East Asian Institute with Hanguk Jungang Daily, and then the Asan report, which came out last month, and then my university's Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, as well as Joseon Daily in May this year. All these 6 or 7 different surveys by different institutions of different countries provide more or less the same result. That is, Korean public opinions toward China have been worsening, declining. I think 3 main characteristics. One, I think since 2004, that's the year when Korea history controversy erupted. Since that year, I think Koreans' public opinions toward China have been worsening, declining, up to now, with the exception of 2013 to 2015. That's the first 3 years of Park Geun-hye administration, during which high expectations were being held for Korea-China relations, although that was shattered later by the THAAD problem. Second, I think younger generations, in Korea, we call them MZ generation, millennium and Z generation, those who are in their 20s and 30s now, they have extremely negative opinions and perceptions about China, which provides a very pessimistic picture about Korea-China relations for the future. And also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the Pew Group survey, which is the most recent one, which look at the 17 countries' public opinions toward China, these 17 countries are mostly, and actually, except with the only exception of Singapore, they are all advanced, developed, and democratic system. And in all these 17 countries, with the only exception of Singapore, public opinions toward China have been very negative. However, if you look at other Pew Global surveys, those countries in Africa, Middle East, and Latin America do not necessarily have negative attitudes and perceptions about China. So we're actually looking at the bifurcation of public opinions toward China, depending upon the level of development and the nature of the regime. So although a lot of scholars say, what is happening right now between the US and China, it's not really a Cold War, because it's not about communism versus democracy. But I think there seems to be some sort of bifurcation taking place. I'm not quite sure what we should call that, but there's some things happening. Now, finally, despite all these public opinions in Korea, negative public opinions about China in Korea, however, there seems to be a sort of major consensus in Korea, particularly among scholars, experts, and pundits, that the Moon Jae-in administration's policy has been more pro-China than the previous administrations. So what does that mean? In democracy, the foreign policy should follow public opinions, or do elites have better opinions, better judgment about that? I think that offers a very interesting political philosophy question.
It's interesting because I recall Park Geun-hye making a real effort also to court China. She went to Beijing for the wartime anniversaries. She talked about the fact that she knew Xi Jinping from earlier when she was a mayor, and he was a mayor. But so it doesn't seem like a new thing with Moon Jae-in.
Okay.
It's only anecdotal, but it seemed to me that one of the big turning points in attitudes toward China happened when Xi Jinping more or less declared himself president for life. A lot of my Korean colleagues thought that was disappointing and a change in China's internal behavior that they found discouraging. So do you think the polling is a reflection of China's foreign policy, or is it disenchantment with the direction of China domestically?
Well, I think overall, I think the thought issue has been a very important factor, because Koreans are not familiar with those economic sanctions that lasted more than 5-6 years, and particularly the younger generations who grew up in the era of prosperity and freedom and democracy. They don't like to be pulled around by other countries because they have a very high level of national self-esteem. So I think there were a variety of factors at work.
Yeah, I hear young people in Korea are more interested in values. Perhaps that's a rising issue for them. And that maybe part of the unhappiness with China is a reflection of human rights values, treatment of minorities. Do you think that's true?
I think to a considerable extent that is true. If you actually look at, what sort of vocabularies are being used on the internet, of course, this is mutual. Many young netizens on the part of Korea refer to China as a communist China. In Korea, they call it Junggong. On the other hand, on the Chinese side, the people on the internet, they use the vocabulary of Namjoseon, that is South Korea, or South Joseon, as opposed to 북조선, that is North Korea. So these are vocabularies that have sort of disappeared for a long time and making a comeback these days by young generation. This is not a good news to me. But anyway, this is how public opinions held by young generations are reflected and manifested in the internet world.
And do you think those opinions make a difference for South Korea's foreign policy? Does the government respond to public attitudes?
Well, I think if I look at the last 4.5 years of the current administration, I think the Korea's foreign policy has been overly and excessively focusing on North Korea at the expense of so many other things. And whether or not that policy has closely followed what people actually think about, I would say no. But then again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a very serious academic and philosophical question. In terms of foreign policy, in the area of foreign policy, do elites have better judgment, or do they have to follow collective intelligence of the general people?
It's an age-old question. We certainly face that in the United States too. Yeah. To change the subject a little bit, one of your special areas of research is about the perceptions of the Chinese population and its relevance to foreign affairs. So from outside, we get the impression that there's rising nationalism in China. Is that an accurate perception? And what does that mean for Chinese foreign policy?
Well, I think, Chinese nationalism has been there for a long time. It's not about the People's Republic of China. Chinese have been proud of themselves since the imperial period. But having gone through a couple of decades of poverty, really under Mao, I think they were looking for some way out. And I think because of this reform and opening since the late 1970s, after 40, 50 years, now they have successfully done some measures of reform and opening. And actually, their economic growth has been rather significant. So as a result, many Chinese at this point consider themselves belonging to a great power, major power. They tend to possess a very high level of self-esteem, and they tend to have a very proud sense of themselves. For instance, let me just give you one data point. According to a Global Times survey that was conducted in last year, 92.3% of Chinese are proud of the status that China is now enjoying. Of course, that doesn't mean there is more room for improvement, but they are very proud. And related to China-Korea relations, the same survey asked the Chinese people whether or not they think Korea respects China. And 69.4% said Korea does not respect China. So I think this is also a source of sort of discontent on the part of Chinese when they look at Korea-China relations. But anyway, going back to the issue of nationalism, I think nationalism has been manifesting itself in many different ways. For instance, as you know, the wolf warriors in terms of elites and diplomats, but also in the more ordinary and younger generations, they also have angry youth. They use a lot of internet and SNS to manifest their discontents about foreign countries and foreign intellectuals who say some things about negative things about China and so on and so forth. So this is a very serious issue. But on the other hand, I also want to offer a very sober point. Many Westerners always say something about the need to democratize China. Okay, democracy is a good thing. I agree. But then again, at this point, China as an authoritarian system has the state apparatus that can control and regulate nationalism to a considerable extent. But once China democratizes, that means China doesn't have any state mechanism to regulate interest groups, public opinions, and media. Who is going to regulate this nationalism and Sinocentrism or Han chauvinism? So I think from a country which is neighboring China, democratic China may be a good news for many, but may not be such a good news for neighboring countries, which will be the direct target of this, Sinocentrism and national.
That's a very interesting point. If public opinion matters in China, if the government needs public support, do you think there's some kind of a trade-off between using foreign policy to offset domestic problems? So if China runs into economic slowdowns or if they're facing some internal dissent, do you think Beijing might respond to that by becoming more adventuresome in foreign policy?
Well, China has become more assertive and often adventurous already since 2013. China's foreign policy was based upon three important principles since 1980s. First one is not assuming leadership. Chinese call it 不当头. And then not seeking hegemony, 不称霸. Third, not expanding territorially, 不搞扩张. Of these three principles, the first one has been missing since 2014. That means, not assuming leadership, 不当头, that has been missing from many state documents since 2014. Why? Because China considers itself already as a leader, not the leader, but as a leader. So, many of these principles, if the first of these three can be missing, what about the other two? In due time, in the future? We don't know. But actually, China is and has become more assertive and has been using instruments of control, which is mostly the economic dependence of many other countries. Whenever it is necessary to use it, it will use. And I think Korea has been a major target since 2017.
Okay, to change the topic again, this time I want to turn to China's view of the US-South Korea alliance. So you've written about this also. You've written about how China's perceived the US-South Korea alliance over time. So what does China wish for in regard to the alliance? And has China been surprised by its durability?
Well, there is no doubt that China currently sees Korea as one of the weakest links in America's networks in Asia. So obviously, China wants to create a crack or a hole in that link. And if they can find the hole, it wants to expand it. There's no doubt that, of course, Korea-US relations were affected not just by China, were affected by Korea and US as well. So bilateral relationship is a very complicated one. But anyway, China's view of the ROK-US relations has been evolving in tandem with what I would call the democratic pendulum. That is, whichever party comes in to power in Korean politics, they may have different orientations and policies for the alliance. So, for instance, from 2003 to 2008, during the Roh Moo-hyun administration, China really sought to create a crack in the alliance relationship. And to a certain extent, they thought they were successful until the Lee Myung-bak administration came in. Once the Lee Myung-bak administration came in, they wanted to mend fences with America, and Beijing realized that Korean-American alliance was much harder to crack than it seemed. And again, Park Geun-hye administration came in, and I think Park Geun-hye administration is a very interesting case in the sense that, despite the fact it was a conservative government, when it came in, they thought improving relations with China was a diplomatic blue ocean, because they wanted to differentiate itself from the Lee Myung-bak administration. In so doing, they couldn't further improve the alliance relationship, because the alliance relationship was already much better. So they wanted to mend fences with China. It was a very sort of atypical of a conservative government in Korea, but nevertheless, they did it. That's why I mentioned earlier, Korean public perceptions toward China were very good during 2013 to 2015 until this start controversy erupted. And then during the current administration, since 2017, a lot has happened. And I don't think elaboration is needed on that. But the comments made by Foreign Minister Chung Jae at the Council on Foreign Relations a week ago, that says a lot about what Moon Jae-in administration is thinking about Korean-American alliance, and it's in reference to China, because Foreign Minister Chung Jae has never defended the U.S. when he was in Beijing. So, it's not really reciprocal. So I think, in any way, in short, there is a sort of zero-sum quality being built in to Republic of Korea's relations with both the U.S. and China.
China's reaction to THAAD was really strong.
Yes.
I could never quite tell if it was because they were actually really concerned about the security dimensions of the THAAD system, or if it was because they were trying to warn South Korea against getting involved with a trilateral relationship, maybe on missile defense, or if China was trying to warn other countries to be careful of China's, what they consider their core interests. I mean, it did not help South Korea and China relations. It seemed like it was counterproductive. So what were they really signaling?
I think there were some security concerns, although it has never been proven. But if you talk to Chinese experts, they say the X-band radar that was placed in Korea has a different angle from that the X-band radars located in Kyoto and Okinawa. So this different angle may provide additional information about the ICBM that will be launched from the northeast of China, and therefore it will provide a sort of a negative impact, have a negative impact on China's strategic position vis-a-vis the U.S. That's what they say. It has never been proven. But anyway, there were some security concerns. But in my view, the main reason they employed economic sanctions against Korea was to discipline Seoul. Because, Seoul's diplomatic behavior in the 2010s, in other words, in the past 10 years, has been too accommodating, not appeasement-oriented for China. If China pulls and pushes, Korea sort of follows through. I think that has been a pattern of action and reaction between Seoul and Beijing. So Beijing wanted to use these economic sanctions on a massive scale to discipline Seoul. And I think to a certain extent it worked. But whether or not it will continue to work that way when there is a change in government, next presidential election, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I have to say that one of the things I do not understand is why China did not react more strongly to the dropping of the revised missile guidelines. To me, that seems much more threatening to China in a security sense than THAAD. But I heard China say very little about the fact that South Korea can now develop its missiles. So why do you think China has not reacted to that more strongly?
Wouldn't you say that, Korea having a longer range of missiles themselves is a better from China's perspective than Seoul allowing INF missiles of the US being located in Korea?
Yeah, I think that's one possible answer, that this is actually a way to maybe create some division in the alliance. That if South Korea has more independent capability, then it has less need for American deterrence. I was wondering if China was thinking that sophisticatedly about the issue. Maybe they are. Okay, how do you assess the current state of U.S.-China relations, and what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, I think there is a very high level of consistency and continuation between the Trump administration and Biden administration as far as the China policy is concerned. Extreme confrontation is what is the parameter that President Biden has set out. Many people say, the ratio between confrontation and cooperation between the US and China will be 70-30. Maybe, but I would say at this point it's probably higher than that, 80-20. I have this hypothesis. Of course, US and China as a G2 would have to cooperate on some issues. But what would determine the area of cooperation as well as the level of cooperation? My hypothesis has two variables. One is geographical, whether or not the issue is about Asia or not. If the issue is about Asia, I think the level of cooperation will be lower. The other variable is it a traditional security or non-traditional security? If it's a non-traditional security issue, I think the level of cooperation will be higher. So let's take an example of North Korean nuclear problem. It's Asia and traditional security. Therefore, the level of cooperation between the two will be very low. We all remember 3 years ago, about this time, I think November 2018, I believe, in Nigeria, US and China cooperated with each other to get the fissile materials from a terrorist group in Nigeria. That happened because it was in Africa. But in Asia, because the zero-sum mentality is so strong, I would not say there would be a possibility. Otherwise, we would have solved the North Korean nuclear problem already.
It's discouraging that the approaches are so different. I mean, it feels like the Biden administration is saying that we will compete and we will cooperate where we can. So they look for areas of cooperation. What I seem to be hearing from Beijing is that China says that we can cooperate, but only if the United States respects China's core interests. So it's almost like a precondition for cooperation.
I think one very big difference between Trump and Biden administration is that Biden administration is not only pushing China, but also pushing itself to develop. You know, if you look at the US, ICA, Innovation and Competition Act, there is a lot of money being poured into developing and advancing knowledge about AI, quantum, and all that. Of U.S. wants to become stronger, not by pushing others, but by developing itself. I think that's the difference between Biden and Trump.
Oh, that's a very interesting observation. I've got one more question, and then we'll turn to audience questions. My last question is kind of inevitable, I guess, and that is, how should South Korea react to the sharpening of the U.S.-China rivalry?
That's a, I would say, $1 question for Korea. Yes, we have been facing this dilemma of whom to support since 2011-12. We have TPP versus RCEP. We have this problem of whether to support AIIB, whether or not to support the Asian security by Asian people, which was a big issue at the CICA meeting in 2014, and then whether or not to attend the V-Day commemoration in 2015 at Beijing, and then South problem, and whether or not to join the FONOPS in South China Sea. And then the INF missile issue, and so on and so forth. Now I think the issue has been, expanding to many other areas. I think fundamentally the problem is that the Korean government, whether it's a conservative or non-conservative, I don't use the term progressive anymore, conservative or non-conservative. We don't really have a very good concept of national interest. If you ask Chinese, they always say sovereignty, security, economic interest. Maybe Americans will say homeland security, democratic values, and freedom, free market, and so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure Koreans, whether educated or not, would have a very good answer when they face this particular question. We should have that consensus about national interests after we have democratized, that is, in 1990s or so. Now, in Korea, public opinions have been so much bifurcated, almost to the verge of being unable to compromise. now I think it's very difficult for Korea to come up with a consensus on what national interest should consist of. Having said that, I think therefore it's a rather I have a rather pessimistic view about whether we can have a very good domestic unity and domestic consensus on how we can deal with this particular dilemma that is derived from the U.S. China strategic competition.
Yeah, my personal observation is that sometimes South Korean leaders or commentators will talk about finding the middle way, finding a bridging role. But to me, that doesn't really work in Washington, D.C., because if you're pro-engagement with China, you don't need a bridge. You want to engage China directly. And if you're against engagement with China, you don't want a bridge because you don't want to engage with them. I don't see what purpose a bridge would serve. Anyway, so let's move on to this audience questions. I want to make sure we get some in while there's still time. I see one we have on North Korea. You've already touched on this, but let's sharpen the point. Can the United States and South Korea count on China to be helpful in denuclearizing North Korea?
Yesterday, I was in a Zoom meeting, a trilateral Zoom meeting, U.S., China, and Korea, and the issue was about North Korea nuclear issue. And actually, that meeting track has been lasting for 7-8 years now. And we were asking the same question every year, that is, do we have a common interest? Do we have the common goal? Do we have a consensus on sequencing and so on and so forth? So we continue to ask the same question. What does that mean? That means the US, Korea, and China all have different views about what denuclearization really means. And if I can say a few words about China's view of North Korea's nuclear problem, I think they have a very different strategic calculus as well as threat perceptions. Unlike the US and Korea, China, since 1950s, lived with nuclear powers, starting with the USSR, India, Pakistan. So China has another nuclear weapon state on its east side. The level of marginal threat that comes from that particular fact is rather small. So they certainly have a different perceptions, threat perceptions, and therefore different strategic calculus about North Korea's nuclear issue than US or the Republic of Korea.
Yeah, I agree with that. It always seemed to me that the Chinese are not so much concerned about North Korea's having nuclear weapons as they're concerned about the fact that North Korean nuclear weapons draw US power into the region. That feels like a real problem. There's a follow-up on North Korea too. So how would you describe the current relationship between China and North Korea and prospects for their future relationship?
Despite so many fuzzes about, revival of North Korea-China relations because of the frequent meetings between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping since 2018, I do not think fundamental nature of North Korea-China relations has changed. Many people say it's a lips and teeth relationship. Of course, there is a certain quality to it, but Kim Jong-un and North Korean leaders have always been aware of the fact that teeth can bite the lip sometime. So I would say that is why North Korean leaders and North Korea has been emphasizing the principle of self-reliance so much. Don't forget that it was Kim Il-sung in 1958 who demanded the Chinese forces to be withdrawn from North Korea. It was not China's decision, it was North Korea's decision. So we should not think North Korea-China relations as another case of weak countries, strong country relationship. doesn't work that way. So I would say, North Korea is still China's only alliance, legally speaking. But whether or not China will actually operate as an ally for the sake of North Korea, that remains to be seen. And I think that vice versa for North Korea. And I would say, if I have to come up with a vocabulary for it, it's more of a sort of a pseudo alliance with limited liabilities.
Yeah, one of the questions often asked in Washington is how much control China actually could exert over North Korea. I remember current Secretary of State Blinken, before he became secretary, talked about this issue. And he said, in his view, China had great leverage over North Korea, but almost no influence.
I would say China does have leverage. I mean, think about the percentage of China's trade in North Korea's total trade, not including all those border trade which are not really on the statistical yearbook. So I think China does have a significant leverage, but the question is whether or not China wants to use it. Because if China uses it, then North Korea-China relations will change forever. So China will not use it until it's absolutely necessary for its own national interest to do so.
Yeah, a Chinese diplomat told me once that Beijing was prepared to punish North Korea for misbehavior on nuclear testing, but they would never go to the point of pressuring the regime to the point where it could become dangerous for the regime, that they feared chaos mostly. And therefore, they think North Korea is rather brittle. So they're afraid to apply too much leverage for fear of toppling the regime. Let's see, so more questions coming in. We have one from Kirk Larson. He's asking, what role, if any, do ethnic Koreans in China play in Sino-ROK relations?
Well, I think Taoxianzu, who are Korean Chinese in China, used to play a very significant role in the 1990s and up until 2000, because they have very good linguistic skills. They also have a good human networks in China. So they could work as a sort of a go-between, for Korean entrepreneurs and Chinese bureaucrats, and vice versa. But by 2010, I think I don't think they no longer play such an important role. I think Koreans have their own extensive human networks now, and Koreans also very intelligent people who can speak good Chinese now, good English as well. So I think the role of ethnic Chinese, ethnic Koreans in China have been declining, I think, actually. But I haven't really done research on that, so I can't be so certain.
Okay, Haley Gordon has asked, given that the younger SNS savvy generation is leading anti-Chinese sentiment, to what extent do cultural battles over China claiming kimchi in the Hanbok, for example, play a role?
Well, for younger generations, the bigger controversy is not really kimchi and Hanbok, but it's actually BTS. So when Chinese netizens are critical of what BTS do, what BTS write on SNS, these younger generations in Korea are really, get angry. But I think this culture can be a very serious area of confrontation down the road, because China is very conscious of its culture. Korea is also very conscious of its culture. But as we have seen, culture artifacts, for instance, I think how many years ago, there was a debate, conflict over Tuanwu, which is one festival. But in Korea, we need to register some artifacts from that festival. Festival is from China, actually. But Korea developed its own artifact that can be used for that festival. So when China wants to possess everything related to what they have created, and even the artifacts that were derivatives of other peoples, not Chinese, I think that could be a very big problem. I often say to my Chinese friends, Chinese martial arts all came from Shaolin Temple, but the monk who actually created that martial arts, Shaolin martial arts, was not Chinese. It was Damo, who was actually from India. Ask Chinese friends, so Chinese martial arts, is it Chinese or Indian? Oh, they are at a loss. So that is my answer to that question.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Our time is winding down. I've got one more question, but it's a really big one. So I'll finish with that. Here's the big question. Does China want a unified Korean peninsula, or does it see value in maintaining North Korea as a buffer state?
Well, frankly speaking, major consensual answer in Korea would be not only China, but also the US or even Japan does not want to see unification. I think it's a conflict resolution 101 says the third party always has interest when the two parties are at conflict. So, but then there will be a variation in the level of wishing the unification. Of course, US want to see the unification more than China and Japan, but we'll see. I think it's more of an empirical question.
Okay, I'm going to cheat and ask one more question, even though I said I wasn't going to, just because I value your expertise so much. I'd like to hear from you. Regarding diplomacy going forward on the peninsula, who does China think should be involved in peace talks? Do they want to have 3-party talks, 4-party talks, 6-party talks?
Well, I think different times had different answers about that question. But when we talk about 4-party issues, whether or not North Korea really wants China on that has been an issue. I think from ROK's point of view, having China was not such a big issue, but it seems to be an issue for North Korea. But then again, I think it should be a phase deal, right? It has to be North Korea, South Korea, North Korea consensus first, and then some sort of guarantee, whether it's a political, legal, or I'm not quite sure, but guarantee by the US and China. But I don't know. There are so many different scenarios about that, and different sort of political forces seem to have different preferences and priorities for it. So, we don't really have a one consensus on that.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Chung. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a great deal. I hope we can invite you to come back and talk about this more, because there's a lot more that could be said, of course.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, now thank you to our audience for tuning in. I would remind you, if you'd like to keep track of KEI's commentary and activities, please check us out on keia.org, our website for future events coming up. So thank you for joining us.